It's the ye old debate. Just how does an equivalent console and PC compare, either better or worse specifications? How big a difference is it between AMD and Nvidia GPUs? And does DLSS have only positives and no negatives? Well, let's get into that and much more in this detailed head-to-head PS5 versus PC. Now, I've been covering PC and console analysis for a very long time, 2013 in fact, and one of the things I always try and refine and improve significantly is getting those analyses as accurate and close as possible and true to the actual comparisons hardware to hardware. And unfortunately, there's a lot of sites out there that don't give reflective information. Most of the time, it's not intentional, but they do not do a comparison at the level that needs to be done to really draw conclusions that are factual and accurate. Now, one of the things that I've been doing recently is trying to pin down those settings and the options, and it's not always possible. But again, with a title such as Death Stranding, like I covered recently, with things such as Deathloop and obviously Horizon Zero Dawn, which uses the exact same Decima engine, one of the benefits is the developers give effectively console spec settings in the menu, which means you get almost exactly the same visual presentation and quality as the consoles. That's not entirely true on everything, and I'll cover that more in this analysis, but we can use that as a benchmark and a baseline to be able to test what the machine is doing when it's running against an equivalent or better spec PC. So here I'm taking my standard, it will be the last time that I do this. I have another spec machine that will be coming in future videos to add to this, but at the moment it's the same 2700, which is a very decent Zen Plus CPU at 3.8 GHz, certainly fast enough to give us way above 60 FPS gaming on this particular game and many other titles. It's certainly not holding back this particular machine at 60 FPS, which is the target that the PS5 is capped at, so it's as high as we can possibly go. Now, if you want to know more about Death Stranding itself, the game, how it runs on PS5, PS4, and all that good stuff in terms of the cracking game that it is, go and check out my second video, which I did a couple of days ago, and that covers that in more detail. Here, I'm only going to discuss the PC to console comparisons and get really nitty gritty in how it stacks up in terms of visual quality, presentation, and performance. One of the biggest changes from the Pro to the PS5 is it's no longer using a checkerboard resolution to get to 4K. The Pro ran at 30 FPS and 3840 by 2160, which is effectively 1920 by 2160, twice the pixels of 1080p, but half the pixels of 4K. That's 4 million versus 8 million. Now, this isn't a like-for-like example, but it gives you an idea of the kind of comparison and performance benefits you're gaining from that. Now, I'm not going to get into that discussion here, it's a video for another time, but overall, the image quality versus the checkerboard 4K on the Pro, as you can see here, against the native 4K is evident. Zoomed in at 500% here, you can see the difference in texture details instantly. It's a lot clearer, it's very smudged and very muddy on the PS4 Pro, and even when you go to the performance mode on the PS5, which is 1800p, again native, it's still clearer than 4K, but in normal gaming distances you wouldn't notice it. Now, moving to the right hand side, you can see all these edges and the dithering on a lot of areas here, but it's still actually quite sharp considering. Now, moving to DLSS on the PC, this is at quality mode, the best they have, you can see that the image quality is sharper, it's cleaner, there's definitely benefits there, but it also loses out on some of those thin objects. And that's because, like checkerboarding, it's reconstructing from a lower image and it's using that temporal AA, jittered points in the sample from one frame to the next to join the dots up. You can also see some differences there on the boxes, so some of the LOD is lower, obviously on the PS4 Pro, but it's also got better shading, self-shadowing in the corners, and the PC even. You can see it highlighting there. And again, the texture details, there's not a massive difference between them. There is a difference here on the PS4 Pro, the way it's obviously reducing the amount of triangles on the floor. It stretches and obscures the image a little bit, so you can see that texture UV map is stretched and warped slightly, but there's not a huge difference in quality there between the two. Certainly not enough to make a drastic impact on your viewing distance at standard viewing angles like you see now. Flicking between the two and going back to the PS5, you can definitely see it's sharper and cleaner, but you can also see that huge reduction on the ground. Now, this is a dynamic title. Some of this is down to the online element, but also this battle here can have different elements on the ground in terms of fish and rocks. I couldn't get the PC to get anywhere near what we're seeing on the Pro here on the PS5, so there is definitely less on screen here, but I don't think that's down to any LOD thing. It's a very dynamic game overall in these elements, so don't draw too much from that particular example. Obviously, the Pro does a good job of generating a close to 4K image from the resolution and solution that it's got. You can see the reduction in image quality, certainly on texture details, high fidelity elements. It's reduced over the quality mode and obviously any 4K version on PC. Now, DLSS quality also is a good solution, but it also has sacrifices. Again, silver bullets only tend to exist in movies and not in real life, and certainly when it comes to technology, everything is a compromise. So the DLSS solution does a better job on thin objects, certainly resolving detail on geometry, but it's not as good on texture details and certainly in motion. You can see here between the two native 4K PS5 PCs, pretty much identical, but that chironium that's going in the air, look at the ghosting that comes in from DLSS quality. Now this gets worse as you move to performance, and it gets arguably better when you go to ultra performance, ironically, but the image is so low, the pixel density is so low at this point that it kind of doesn't have all of that ghosting you can see quite clearly there. But there is a bigger impact to ultra performance, and that is in the texture details. Look how blocky and columnized the textures become on ultra performance, and going back to the standard native 4K, it doesn't look anything like that. Now, DLSS quality is as good as native 4K, but it's no better. It's not improving those details, but you can see those screen space shadows at the top. They start to disappear underneath the rocks as you go down the stack, even from quality. You can see them now in the quality mode on PS5, and watch as the resolution reduces. You see those screen space shadows disappear? Just there. And that is an impact on performance. When you're dropping pixel counts, you just lose detail, and even DLSS can't put that back. Ultra performance, there's no shadows there at all, but the textures look horrible. And obviously you can see that as you flip between the two. Now moving up, you can see those dithered, almost checkerboard-like symptoms on those thin edges. It's definitely resolving a lot more thin geometric objects that aren't there in the standard native 4K. But you're also getting reduction to texture details artificially on the Nvidia card. Look at the fragile sign to the left. Now, as you flick through all of these versions, even the FCAS version at 4K, which is 1620p effectively here, using this solution, it's definitely softer, it's losing a lot of detail in the image, but the texture details are still pretty solid. It doesn't have all the refined elements of thin areas and certainly on geometry, but going to 4K on it, it looks better than an Nvidia card at 4K, very similar to the PS5 at 4K. Look at the texture details I flick back and forth. Even at native 4K and then DLSS at quality, it really isn't holding up to this kind of scrutiny. Remember, this is 500 times, so I'm emphasizing these issues. That's the point of this analysis. But once you zoom back out and look at the game between the two, it's very hard to notice the point. And that's very true of the checkerboard solution on Pro. So here we can look at this in an example. Look at static native 4K versus DLSS quality. You can see those thin edges on the fence, the grayling at the background, all that detail's there. But once you move, everything starts to ghost, smudge and blur together. Side by side, you can see stationary the DLSS quality is better, but once you're moving, all that high frequency detail is lost and the native 4K looks better. It's certainly more unstable, but it doesn't have all that ghosting and smearing that a TAA, heavy TAA solution such as DLSS is doing here. Now, it's not all bad news. The game itself at this level on PC has this horrible frame blending technique for motion blur on near objects. As you can see here, the grass just looks like a ghosted frame blend, which doesn't happen on DLSS quality, and it looks nice and clean, and that does improve the close level of detail as you walk, but the background and texture details can come at the cost of that, even at DLSS quality, and as you go down the stack it gets worse. And what I'm saying here, this is the problem that PS5 doesn't have, or the Pro. As you can see here, it doesn't ghost, doesn't blend those frames anywhere near the same way, so therefore it doesn't have an issue to be fixed on consoles. So what I'm saying here is Nvidia have a problem that they are fixing on their own cards that aren't as evident across AMD cards and certainly not evident on consoles. So DLSS is a great solution, just like checkerboarding, and generally it's a better solution than checkerboarding, obviously, but it's not a silver bullet, doesn't fix everything, and some of the things it's fixing aren't present on other versions, even in the PC space. But DLSS quality is the one you would choose because the performance game is very big in terms of what you're getting back. It can almost close the gap between the PS5, and we'll get into performance next. So, as you can see here, moving into the DLSS quality mode, the only one I'm going to test here when I get into the performance, you're gaining around 37% performance improvement in like-for-like conditions. So it's a no-brainer. You'd absolutely would turn it on if you have the option within the engine. Even though all the issues I've just covered notwithstanding, it's still a better solution than running it on an Nvidia card at native 4K. That's not the same answer for AMD cards I've just covered, but it certainly is a benefit. Now, this doesn't mean that in this particular settings on the same as PS5 it's a locked 60 FPS, but it is close to it. In action, as you can see here, it can dip into the mid 50s at certain points, and certainly in some of the heavier sections, such as it looking in the glass, obviously with the VSync turned on, then it can again dip down to the low 50s. So it's somewhere around the same or better than the PS5 at the same settings, but again, it's using that DLSS quality mode, which is not a native 4K. But this video is all around comparing the hardware, so let's get into that. Now, there's two conversations, VSync on and VSync off. So PS5 is VSynced, as you see here. So this is comparing the PlayStation 5 at native 4K, the quality mode, and native 4K, the identical settings on the RTX 2070 overclocked and the RX 5600 XT overclocked. So the RTX 2070 is a 9.3 teraflop machine at this point. It's overclocked just over 2 gigahertz. It's got more bandwidth than the PS5 has because it's just the GPU, and obviously the 5600 XT has got less on both. But what you can see here in the opening minutes, it's only 9% because it's capped at 60 FPS on the PS5. It obviously can run higher than that. But when it starts to dip, you can see the deltas. And by the time we reach the first minute of this video, we have our biggest gap at this point. 60 FPS versus 40 and 31. That's a 50% delta in the benefit of the PS5 between the RTX 2070. From there on in, you can look at the average at the bottom to see the deltas between the two, and as they shift and move around. Going through this entire video, it fluctuates and ends up somewhere around 36% on average. But at the high points, it can be 65% to the benefit of the PS5 over the RTX 2070, and at points 100% to the RX 5600 XT with VSync on. Now you can see here as I show the outputs of the CPU allocation, the GPU allocation, and the overall command queue at the top of the RTX 2070 and the 5600 XT. Now you can see something I've said before many times, which is VSync has a cost. You're introducing a sync state in your engine that can cause it to stall certain elements of your hardware. You can see that here. Look at the utilization queue at the top. At certain points, it can be 80% utilization and even worse on the AMD card. That can drop down to the 50s very briefly, but that all adds up, and this costs, and this is why you're seeing a lot of the RX 5600 hitting 30 FPS capped. That VSync is having a bigger impact, and we'll get to that, what that impact looks like in a minute. It's certainly affecting both of them. There's points where the RTX 2070 is right down to those 30 points here, as you can see as well. This is a very heavy point in the engine in terms of GPU load. Remember, this is a complete GPU test. There's no point here where it's being CPU bound on any machine. So what we're seeing here is a combination of the driver cost, the DirectX 12 API layer, and all of that overhead affecting the PC, as well as the fact that it's VSync. There's a combination here, and you can see that the driver cost is obviously heavier on the AMD card than it is on the Nvidia card. But we are seeing anywhere from 33% up to 64% delta in the benefit of the PS5 to the RTX 2070. And obviously that can be higher against the RX 5600 XT, obviously. So what does VSync coming off actually give us? Well, let's flick to that now. So here's exactly the same section, tested again, completely GPU limited, but we can instantly see that the performance levels for both the PC cards have now gone up. They've gone up significantly in certain points. In fact, we can see throughout this entire section that at points, the AMD card is being affected by 40% due to that VSync being on and off. It's going from a low of 30 FPS, capped at 30 FPS basically, and then when you turn VSync off, for the exact same section, it's now 42 FPS. This also means that that cost can sometimes cause the RX 5600 to fluctuate higher very, very small percentile, 3% higher than the RTX 2070, but that itself also benefits. Anywhere from around 7% up to 15% turning VSync off. The best point you've got is you go from 35 FPS at 2 minutes into the video on the RTX 2070 with VSync on, and that now hits 40 FPS with VSync turned off. So you can see where VRR works, which is what VRR is for. It doesn't fix fluctuating frame rates when they're capped. VRR is to stop tearing, infecting your image on screen, to allow the screen to flip when that new frame is ready. Unfortunately, when you VSync a title, you end up with a torn screen because it's out of sync. That's what VRR, variable refresh rate, is for. It's not to fix games that dip below that are also capped and VSynced as well. So you might be thinking, why is this happening? Well, you can see here on the left and the right on those command queues. Look at the utilization of the GPU. It can go from 60% up to 90% consistently here. But you can also see that we're getting around 5 to 6% more out of the CPU. And that's because the driver cost is quite expensive when you're speaking between the game engine and the hardware itself, the API process basically, that interface that talks between the two. And here, when you turn VSync off, you're stopping these stalls, these sync points that have to happen. You're reducing the cost and maximizing the performance. You can see the power deficit. Just look at the GPU power deficit here on the AMD card. You're going somewhere from around 80 to 90 watts up to 130. It's being heavily utilized. And that means you're not getting more performance out of the same hardware. You're using the performance that's already available that's being hidden by that sync cost that we've just discussed. Now, this is the same on the PS5 and all consoles. Once you VSync, there will be a cost. Now, I don't suspect the PS5 is losing 40% at its best point, but probably somewhere between 10 to 20%, somewhere fluctuating between those levels. And that means the RTX 2070 benefits exactly as the AMD card does when you take off VSync. It's not as big, but you can see again that Zen 2700 is gaining around 6 to 12% benefit, just like the 3600 does, but GPU utilization is higher, therefore overall performance is higher because it reduces the driver cost in the sync state that is caused by a VSync method. Now, this means on average, now remember with VSync on the PS5, had VSync off, it would average higher than what it is at the moment. It would go above 60 FPS, but with it on, it's 36.6% faster than the RTX 2070, which in itself is 20% faster on average than the RX 5600 XT. So those kind of numbers are quite big, and they show the delta between all these formats. But if you take VSync off, then the AMD is disproportionately improved over the Nvidia card because that driver cost, that sync state, is not quite as expensive on that particular construction and architecture. So you gain 9% on the RTX 2070 on average, and you gain nearly 16% on the 5600 XT, which means that it goes from a deficit of 20% on average down to a deficit of 13%, which is almost identical, that teraflop difference. Now, there are some benefits in certain engines, specifically here around one designed around the PS4 Pro, so you can see all the deltas on screen and all the figures that play out between VSync on and VSync off. And at this point, with an engine designed around PS4 and PS4 Pro, not the PlayStation 5, it is a native app, I know, but it isn't designed around the architectural construction of the PlayStation 5. The benefit is big. This is potentially showing that the PS5 is performing around 36% on average, and at points it can be 64% better than an RTX 2070 overclocked, much closer to an RTX 2070 Super. Now, not every title will be the same, but this gives you an idea of the kind of performance levels you can expect throughout this generation, and those gaps will only get bigger as they always do. At the start of the generation, PC hardware does a better job of competing against that than when later on in the generation developers and engines have all been designed around the newer architecture, and that could deviate more away from what the market, the PC market, is. And that also means that AMD cards tend to benefit more throughout the generation than Nvidia cards, because obviously that is what is at the heart of both of these consoles. And a lot of what I'm discussing here will be very true for the Series X. Now, in relative terms, that means that in this particular game, and I stress this particular game, the PS5 is performing more in line with an RTX 3070 than an RTX 2070. So just let that sink in for a moment and where we might be in a year or so's time. This will only benefit titles, though, that are geared specifically around the architectural benefits. Now remember, you can also watch this footage unspoilt by me talking over the top of it to get all the analysis you need that I'm giving you the information here. Remember, I have no skin in the game. At this point, I'm only interested in giving information that's factual and accurate and detailed, and that's exactly what this is. Now, I'm looking to improve my suite of testing, and again, this is all around me trying to improve my channel quality and getting levels of metrics and details that are much better, testing PC more thoroughly, testing games more thoroughly across the board, and taking a little bit more time. I may not be the first, but I do always aim to be the best, and that's not around being the best quality. It's about being as close to accurate as possible and giving you information that not only explains what's going on, highlights what's going on, but also gives you detailed metrics that you can use to evaluate what you want to buy and what experience you're going to get from the hardware you may own. Anyway, that's another video drawn to a close. Now remember, you can help support this channel. I do this all as a part-time side gig. So everything I do here is from my own fair hands, with no help from anybody else, but you can help by subscribing down below, by giving it a thumbs up, and obviously commenting to help that algorithm, and where possible joining my Patreon supporters by giving me any dollars and pounds you can to really help improve the quality here and obviously my equipment. I don't make much money from YouTube at all. Whatever I do make, I put back in, including buying new hardware to try and improve the technology and information I'm giving you here. It helps working with IGN, the good guys and girls over there, and working with Destiny. We've got some good stuff coming up very soon. So obviously check me out there and check me out here, but support the channel and keep it NX Gamer as long as you possibly can, and I'll catch you on the next one.